on our planet. It is putting historic pressure on our natural resources, climate and natural environment, and costing us trillions of dollars a year. At this year's theme makes clear the power to change is in our hands. Our actions are our future. Last month, the world gathered for the United Nations Food Systems Summit. Countries made bold commitments to transform food systems, to make healthy diets more affordable and accessible, and to make food systems more efficient, resilient, and sustainable at every step, from production and processing to marketing, transportation, and delivery. We can all change how we consume food and make healthier choices for ourselves and our planet. In our food systems, there is hope. On this World Food Day, join us as we commit to take transformative action to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals through food systems that deliver better nutrition, a better environment, and a better life for every person.
Great messages this World Food Day. Can I now introduce Barbara Ward, President of Nutrition Australia New South Wales and National Board Member. Barbara, you are on mute.
There we go.
Yes.
I'll start again. Good morning, distinguished guests. Look, I hope you did enjoy that message from UN Secretary General on this World Food Day. Our action is our future. I hope you enjoyed the powerful message. We are very honoured today to have esteemed guest speakers in conversation. They have given their time so generously, so thank you. It is a beautiful Saturday morning, so, doubly thank you to you. The Honourable Matt Kean, Treasurer Minister for Energy and Environment, Dr. Bruce Neal, Professor Tim Flannery and Peter Kenny, thank you for being with us. Can I also say a special thanks to David Brady, who is a retired elite athlete, and board member Raja, who was with us this morning, and our other board members, staff, consultants, and many volunteers. Our special thanks also to our sponsors, Share, Adrian Prakash, LCI Yogesh, Nathan from Culinary Institute, Aboriginal Culinary Institute, and a heartfelt thanks to all our sponsors. Before I begin, can I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today? I am at a place called Darramung people, and I pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging, and I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. This is the first Saturday of freedom in New South Wales, and many people are probably unable to attend. Some rang me late yesterday and even this morning saying, I'm having brunch with my friends, I'm going shopping, I'm meeting families, and look, who could blame them, and so on. So, those of you who are here, thank you for being here. Today, it is my desire that you will learn much, have hope, and feel empowered to make a difference, not only today, but for future generations. National Nutrition Week in New South Wales is celebrated annually and coincides with World Food Day. The week has been full of activities, and I thank the many speakers, governments, guests, sponsors for their support for our message of Try for 5, get more veg in your life. With mental health on the increase, we know good nutritious food can help. Exercise and nutrition is imperative for our general well-being. Nutrition Australia New South Wales is a not-for-profit charity and is a peak body in this state. We work with various levels of governments, corporates, community groups, aged care providers, hospitals, allied health, universities, industries, and individuals. Our health is the most important asset, and Nutrition Australia New South Wales plays an important role in helping people with their diet journey. We advocate, educate, and hold events such as these to draw attention. Our work includes cooking demonstrations, recipes, menu assessments, canteen orders, shopping tours, food safety and training, and healthy advisory service. Educational programs in childcare and centres and schools with Healthy Lunchbox, Reclaim Lunchbox, and Mighty Bites are something we do every day. Our work is closely aligned with New South Wales Health Strategy, and indeed we work with them. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it is would have been my pleasure, but it still is my pleasure to introduce the Honourable Matt Kean. But unfortunately, we got a message late last night. He's not going to be able to join us, and he regrets that very much. But as you can understand, with his new elevation and Parliament sitting, it is no surprise that he can't be with us today. It just was not possible to make it. But he was very kind in providing us with the video. So can we just share the video message from the Honourable Matt Kean? Thank you, Laura.
Can I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. It's a pleasure to join you for the World Food Summit Day, and I extend a special welcome to Dr. Bruce Neal, Professor Tim Flannery, my great friend Barbara Ward, Nutrition Australia New South Wales, and board members and guests. National Nutrition Week in New South Wales is a major event in the state's calendar, and I congratulate and thank Barbara Ward for bringing this important topic to everyone's attention and for holding a number of high-profile events. As Treasurer and Minister for Energy and Environment, I'm delighted to participate in this incredible panel, and I'm so sorry that I can't be with you in person. Nutrition Australia inspires Australians to eat for health, also to understand and appreciate how important this topic is for our agricultural industry as we look towards the future. World Food Day commemorates the founding of the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. Events will be held in 150 countries around the world to mark World Food Day, making it one of the most celebrated international days of the year. And it will also be featured at Expo Dubai with activities and events calling for global solidarity in rethinking and reshaping our food systems. As the Treasurer and Minister, I commend Barbara for her efforts for New South Wales to be part of this celebration. The message of World Food Day is more critical than ever. Climate shocks, conflict, and the COVID-19 pandemic have disrupted millions of lives and livelihoods in the past year, while humanitarian emergencies in Afghanistan, Haiti, and other hotspots have worsened global food security. The pandemic has made us more aware that health and the economy are inextricably connected. An emphasis on sustainable and fair food systems for improved economy, impact of climate, environment on food security, the flow-on effects on health, economy, and social outcomes is more important than ever before. More than 3 billion people, almost 40% of the world's population, cannot afford a healthy diet. We need to change how we produce and consume our food and build more resilient, inclusive, and robust food systems that create a difference. World Food Day is a call to action. The FAO Director General, together with other heads and other Rome-based UN agencies, will officially launch this year's celebrations with a hybrid event that will be held in Rome. We're delighted that Nutrition Australia New South Wales is also calling this to action. So let's get behind Barbara and her team to raise awareness so that our future generations can enjoy the environment. We also have the responsibility to spread the word, building awareness about the importance of a healthy and sustainable lifestyle. Efforts to mitigate climate change, environmental degradation, and our well-being all depend on it. We celebrate our food heroes and recognise the farmers, producers, and others who provide food to their communities, helping to grow, nourish, and sustain our world. Nutrition Australia New South Wales aims to give families, communities, and everyone hope for a sustainable, healthy future through their many campaigns. I once again thanks Barbara and the Nutrition Australia New South Wales Board for their efforts in keeping New South Wales, our New South Wales community, healthy, raising awareness of nutrition, and for this amazing event. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Matt. That was a lovely, lovely message from Matt, and it is unfortunate that he can't be with us. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we keep moving along as time is of the essence. We have received many good wishes from a lot of MPs and ministers, and I want to thank them all for their support. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Bruce Neal, Professor of Medicine at University of New South Wales and Executive Director of George Institute Australia. Bruce has broad-based clinical public health research expertise with a strong focus on translation of research findings into enhanced care and better policies. He has a particular experience in the field of blood pressure and diabetes and has played lead roles in multiple large-scale clinical trials. He's also a long-standing interest in the environmental detriments of chronic disease and the potential for changes in the food supply to deliver large, cost-effective and equitable health gains. He has recently completed a largest ever trial of salt reduction with results that should change the way everyone prepares season's food. Dr. Neal launched a popular food switch smartphone application to empower healthier consumer food choices, and his food policy work seeks to change the way that food is manufactured, retailed, consumed, using business and policy levers. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bruce Neal.
Barbara, it's my pleasure to be here. So I've got 3 to 5 minutes to make a couple of opening statements, and I wanted to just start. I probably don't need to remind you, but poor diet is the leading cause of premature death and disability in New South Wales and Australia, and the reason for that is not that most foods are individually very bad for you, but it's because almost everyone eats a suboptimal diet. They do it for all their life, and the effects accumulate over many years. Tobacco, of course, is much worse for you than most foods, but fortunately, with the very effective controls we've put in place, it's now a very small minority of the population that smokes. And the adverse effects of lots of people doing a little bad thing throughout their entire lifetime ends up being a really significant impact. The other important thing to remember is that people don't eat poor diets because they're sloths and gluttons. They eat a poor diet because we have a broken food system. And very broadly, the food industry model at a large scale is to take low-cost based product and large amounts of salt, sugar and fat to optimize the sensory aspects of that product, to package it up in large portion sizes, so they're everywhere, all the time at low cost, on a high volume, low margin business. Now, that works extremely well for the food industry, but it's frankly a disaster for public health. So the main players in the system are the industry, who make and market the foods. We've also got government that controls the environment in which that happens, and of course the customers that consume those products. And there are correspondingly 3 main places that we can take action. So if I first think about manufacturers, so I so hate to say it, but frankly, most manufacturers are interested only marginally in health, because for manufacturers, it's all about taste, price, brand loyalty, and ultimately, of course, shareholder value. And health at the moment gets only a marginal look in. Government ought to be interested because of the huge financial burden that the adverse effects of poor diet have on the health system. But I think one of the key challenges for government is the parts of government that deal with food regulation are highly disconnected from the parts that deal with paying for the adverse consequences through the health system. There are tremendous technical staff within government who know and really understand the issues, but they're either powerless to act or are mostly looking for a quiet life. And the power brokers themselves, the politicians, are lobbied relentlessly by industry. And lobbying groups such as the Australian Food and Grocery Council are incredibly effective in the strategies that they've used to argue against the formulation, labelling and many other changes over the last few decades, and are probably responsible for more death and disability over the last few decades than any other organisation. And finally, consumers. Consumers have been the target of most action. But it's been expensive and pretty much ineffective, mostly focused on large-scale community education programs, which are not going to be useful when the surrounding food environment is so adverse to them actually making change. Another problem with this focus on consumers is that it ends up being a huge distraction, because everyone can point to highly visible initiatives that are being undertaken, and that means that other things don't get the priority that they need. So I've painted a bit of a gloomy picture there. Is there any hope for the future? Well, I think there is. Consumers are getting more interested in health and are starting to show a willingness to pay for it. But I think this is always going to be a marginal part of the solution. Government can deliver solutions. I mean, here in Australia, we have had a government over the last few decades that has done tremendous things with tobacco. We have a very effective system for preventing acute food poisoning, but that was developed decades ago and it needs upgrading to deal with the chronic food poisoning that we now get and that causes most of our premature disease burden. We need government to be bold, free of lobbying, transparent and accountable. And there are great examples of how this can happen in the UK, Latin America, with salt reduction strategies, sugar taxes and labelling. Unfortunately, in Australia, we don't seem to be getting the government engagement that we really need. And then finally, industry. Well, industry is only going to respond to market forces and the regulatory environment. There may be a few exceptions where health and commerce might align. Barbara, you mentioned the salt study that we've just finished. We showed very clearly that switching regular salt for an added potassium, reduced sodium salt alternate can reduce risks of stroke, heart attack, and premature death. And salt substitutes are a little bit more expensive than salts, and there may be a commercial incentive for industry to get behind these and to try to market them more widely. But it's only a fraction of the cause of the disease burden that we could get at in Australia, and it's only a tiny part of the profits for the food industry. And it's really not clear that similar opportunities are available for much of the rest of the sector. So some hope, but it is going to require a real change in the way that we think about it from the consumers, industry, and also the government perspective. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bruce. I can see we're going to have a very lively panel discussion now after the other two speakers. So thank you for that very much. I appreciate it. It is now my pleasure to introduce my friend, Professor Tim Flannery. Tim and I worked together some years ago, and Tim's been wonderful in helping me whenever I have asked for it. So Tim, from me personally, thank you. Professor Flannery is the Chief Councillor at the Climate Council. He is one of Australia's leading writers on climate change, an internationally acclaimed scientist, explorer and conservationist. Professor Flannery was named Australian of the Year in 2007. He has held various academic positions, including Professor of the University of Adelaide, Director of the South Australian Museum in Adelaide, Principal Research Scientist at Australian Museum and Visiting Chair at the Australian Studies at Harvard University in the Department of Organism and Evolutionary Biology. A well-known presenter on ABC Radio, NPR and the BBC for more than a decade, he has also written and presented several series of documentary channels, including The Future Eaters, The Wild Australasia, Islands in the Sky, The Bushfire. His books include Here on Earth and The Weather Makers. His latest book is Life Selected Writings. Please welcome Professor Flannery. Tim.
Thank you so much, Barbara. Look, apologies, my camera just stopped working this morning on my computer, so even though I dressed up, you won't be able to see me for this. I'm calling in from Dharawal country, just south of Sydney. And what I want to talk to you about this morning is really it's the production side of food, so the environmental impact side of food production. I think it's fair to say that the climate crisis has done or is doing for food production what COVID did for many trends in our society, such as working from home. So it was already a trend there, but the COVID pandemic really accelerated that trend. So in terms of food production, there are two major trends which are already started, which are being rapidly accelerated by climate change. The first is a trend towards growth of our food products under more controlled conditions. So the traditional method of food production is a broadacre agriculture where you put on your fertilizer, you put on your pesticides or whatever. They tend to leak away into the environment and they're put on rather ineffectively. And you get something, you get your crop in, but you're having an impact on the environment. Over the last couple of decades, we've seen, particularly in vegetable production, the use of greenhouses really trend upwards. And in Australia, for example, there is a major greenhouse complex in South Australia called Sundrop Farms, which is run from a solar facility, so no fossil fuels at all involved in producing the tomatoes at Sundrop Farms. And they get a pretty much a perfect crop. I asked them why they didn't have a cannery associated with this massive tomato farm. I said, we just don't get enough defective tomatoes You grow tomatoes under controlled conditions. There's no leakage, no need for pesticides because you're in a greenhouse, you're controlled. There is all optimal use of nutrition, of fertilizer, and no leakage from that system, and a production of a perfect crop. So it's very highly productive. And we've seen more and more of this trend develop. People are now growing leaf greens, for example, in cities under controlled conditions. So we do away with transport requirements under those conditions. So that's a quite important, they're important developments that are giving us a more sustainable base for our food production. If I have a look at the second major trend which is occurring, it's eating further down the food chain. So for decades now, we've all been eating more meat. That trend has thankfully reversed and is taking us in some very, very interesting directions. Of course, to produce a kilogram of meat, you need 10 kilograms of plant material because the animal has to live and metabolize, and there's a certain loss as you go up the food chain. So it's a good thing to eat lower down the food chain. Two of the probably notable developments that you may have heard of in this regard is one, the development of meat substitutes. That is really now using plant matter. That is really becoming a well-established industry. Prices are still high, production volumes are small, but I think we can see where the future's heading there. And a second, even further well-advanced example is in dairy. So if you go to a dairy cabinet in a supermarket today, you'll see about 25% of the yogurts and milks and so forth aren't dairy products. They're dairy substitutes, they're almond milks, soy milks, various things like that. So we're eating lower down the food chain, and that is a very good thing. But we're really only at the beginning of this great journey of eating further down the food chain. One of the most exciting developments that I've read of just in the last 12 months involves a group called Solar Foods, who are a Finland-based startup company. And what they have started to do is to produce basically flour, wheat flour, using bacteria. So they have bacteria that can produce, through the insertion of genes in their genetic code, all of the starches and proteins that wheat can produce. And they also use hydrogen, which comes from electrolysis, so clean energy, hydrogen development to feed those bacteria and archaea. And they can produce in a vat what a wheat farmer might take 1,000 hectares to produce of wheat development. So you can imagine, as these things start taking off, how important this is going to be. That broadacre agriculture, leaky broadacre agriculture that's so environmentally damaging may be replaced by food production, and you get an indistinguishable product. The wheat flour you get, you can't taste the difference, and nutritionally it's the same. Out of a vat, which might be within the city, using clean energy sources to feed those bacteria. So these trends are extremely interesting from an environmental perspective. You know, if we project out 50 years, we can imagine a world where even with 8 billion people on the planet, we may be feeding people from produce which is largely gathered from within the cities. You can imagine this happening, and the broadacre landscapes beyond the cities may be reverting to a more natural state. We may see large-scale carbon capture as the forests regrow back, which is helping us with our greenhouse gas problem, and a more stable food supply. At the moment, our food supply is at the mercy of a changing climate. We can see the impacts and the damage that's occurring. These trends, which are being accelerated by that challenge, I think are extremely interesting and perhaps represent our future. So that's just a small insight into the I think the synergy between climate change, food security, and the environment. I think there are some very promising trends there, but of course we have to get through this period, this intermediate period, where still we're all dependent upon broadacre cropping and so forth, and therefore very vulnerable to climate impacts. And I think there's a great concern that we may see starvation again and increased food insecurity before we get to this more promised land, if you want, of new technologies. So I'll leave it there, Barbara, and you can move on.
Thank you, Tim. Wow, that was quite powerful and thought-provoking. Thank you for that. I'm looking forward to some discussion around it. Our last but not least of the panelists that I welcome now is Peter Kenny. Peter was appointed chairman of Maggie Beer Foundation in 2018. He was the founding director of Colmar Brunton, one of Australia's largest consumer and social research companies, and he's also the vice president of the world's largest network of independent research companies. The common threads to Peter's career has been in the interest in the food industry and understanding the drivers of social change. Peter talks on Food Summit, food security, impact of not getting enough nutritious foods in seniors at home or in the retirement villages and the aging population. Peter and I have been talking about this for quite a number of years now, since I think you became the chair. Peter, can you please all welcome Peter Kenny?
Thank you, Barbara, and hello to everybody this morning, and thank you to Nutrition Australia for putting this day together. It's very admirable and great. What I want to talk about this morning in rather short time is the food, nutrition and dining experience in aged care, which is the interest of the Maggie Beer Foundation. And by the way, Maggie sends very warm welcomes and hello to everybody as well. So we've been shocked, I think, to some extent by the outcomes of the Royal Commission in many regards. And one of the top 4 or main outcomes of concern from the Commission was the food and nutrition of our older Australians, particularly in residential aged care. The problem is, you know, really surprisingly serious. As you get more involved in aged care, you see that it is so variable. There are wonderful examples of terrific homes where people are looked after really well, quality of life is high, and food is enjoyable experience, but the opposite is equally there and perhaps more so. The issues are geographically related, so we have different situations in regional and rural Australia. We have different situations in different states. We have different types of aged care providers, all different public and private organisations are involved. So it's highly variable. The outcome of the Royal Commission was that some urgent action needed to be taken around food and nutrition. It was such a serious issue for older Australians. So what I want to report on for everybody today, there have been a couple of initiatives that we've been pleased to be some small part of, which I hope has moved the game forward a little bit. The main one that I want to talk about is an initiative from the Federal Department of Health to put together a National Congress on food and nutrition. So this was an event run in Sydney and also online like this due to COVID in February of this year, where the government invited peak bodies, providers of all types, leading allied health, and lots of other representatives and stakeholders in the aged care to come together and actually, I think for the first time almost globally, talk about the collective issues that have an impact on nutrition, health and well-being of older Australians. And we covered all sorts of issues from the lack of transparency and accountability that exists, the awareness of the issues of food and the consequences of poor diets were not recognised particularly widely. To that end as well, there's been very little research done globally or particularly in Australia around food consumption and nutrition. And to that extent, even the nutrition guidelines at that age group are not relevant. Then they haven't been updated, although there is initiatives underway. So it, I think, made it more clear some of the sides of the issues that could be tackled. We found ways of identifying best practice, and to some extent, you know, some of the things to improve food in aged care are quite obvious and they're achievable, and they're not particularly expensive. So the barriers were talked about and the problems. So they came down to consumer choice and dignity, knowledge and customizing of nutrition to all the individual elderly, oral health, swallowing, dysphagia, and hydration problems. The issues of food production and presentation. So that's food production of what's available in Australia, by the way, plus what needs to be imported, food production systems within aged care itself, and how food is to be presented so it's attractive to eat and enjoyable. Issues around menu planning, issues around the dining experience. It seems obvious that you could rearrange a dining room so people want to be there, but it's not always the case. And in particular, issues around staff skills and training. And this has become quite visible after the Congress, that the issues of staff in aged care are quite chronic and severe. Very relatively poorly paid, undertrained and under-resourced staff across many parts of aged care. So that was the subject of the Congress. It was a lot of goodwill came out of that. We're very pleased with that. We're also very pleased that the department was able to take much of the recommendations on board quickly, which we believe contributed to the federal budget. An increase in $10 allowance per residence was an immediate outcome and very welcome. But I think even more importantly than that, a system put in place for reporting, mandatory reporting around the areas of nutrition and the dining experience. So we're very hopeful. It's very early days with aged care, but we think there are goodwill and the steps are underway, Barbara. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks very much, Peter. That's lovely. All right, we will now hop on to our panel discussion about a number of things. And since it is World Food Day, our actions are our future, I just wanted to quickly touch on hunger around the world. You know, it still is one of the biggest and most solvable problems in the world. Every day, more than 700 million people go to bed empty stomach. And, you know, there's all these statistics around people due to COVID. It's now additional 130 million people who are at risk. The map shows there's a WFH map that tracks the core indicators of acute hunger, like household food consumption, livelihood, child nutrition, and access to clean water. Now, UN tells us that the world is not on track to achieve zero hunger by 2030. If trends continue the way it is, the number of people affected by in the world by hunger could surpass 840 million by 2030. Now, is it really, I want the panel to give me some idea of how realistic do you think the SDG targets are for net zero hunger, and what role does Australia or can Australia play on a global scale? Who wants to take that? Bruce, you want to take it? Tim? I can't see Tim. Have we lost Tim? Is there?
I'll make a comment to begin with, Barbara. I should say this is absolutely not my top area of expertise, but my sense of this is that hunger is frequently not a consequence of there being insufficient food in the world, but is rather a consequence of there being inadequate systems to distribute that food and to make sure that there are environments that people live in whereby they are able to get access to the food that we need. Now, some of the solutions that we heard Tim talking about are, you know, clearly great potential solutions to that because they might localize food production and give people a whole range of different ways to get hold of food. But I fear that many of those, while, you know, obviously fantastic pieces of technology and great opportunities, are going to be solutions that end up hitting the developed world and the most well-off places in the first instance, again, unless we are somehow able to change the system at the very highest level with a real focus on equity.
Yeah, no, I actually agree with you, Bruce, and it's quite interesting that you know, it's not food itself, it's the way the food supply is happening. You have, I'll stick to you, I just can't seem to get Tim at the moment. You have a technology, Food Switch. I have to say that I use that, well, my husband uses that to buy food for me. Can you tell me if your app has actually changed behaviours, consumer behaviours, and is there a link between health literacy and nutrition literacy and hunger?
Yeah, so very briefly, the Food Switch app that Barbara's speaking about is an app that allows you to scan the barcode of any product in Australia, or indeed about a dozen other countries around the world, see on screen immediate, easily understandable information about how healthy a product is, and also see listed next to it alternatives that you could switch to if you wanted to make a healthier choice. Now, my colleagues tell me off the whole time for saying this, but from a public health perspective, that part of it is not particularly useful because while it's great for the people who download the app, use the app and have the motivation to do it, most people don't. What has been much more useful from the Food Switch program is the regular, annually updated, complete data sets we have for multiple countries around the world, which show what's happening to the average composition of the food supply. And we can then use those data to make cases to government and to industry about actions that they need to take. So I think that Food Switch has had some tremendous impacts, but perhaps not the direct sort of obvious impacts when you first pick up the app and start using it.
No, thank you. Just on that, Bruce, you also talked about, the roles the government can play and the roles the industry and community can play. It might be plausible to take action. Like, what sorts of action do you think community itself can take to educate and empower governments to talk about making those changes? I mean, like you, I often get a little bit frustrated talking to the bureaucrats and not getting anywhere. I might add, I'm not a nutritionist. I just have a passion. And so I push that barrel quite strongly. What is it that we can do? There's also been this, the national strategy for obesity prevention. We all know that diabetes and obesity is on the rise. Do you think, and Tim, if you can hear us, do you think, there is an appetite to implement some of those reforms?
So I think community would really welcome sort of much more substantive reforms than are actually delivered by government. So, for example, I think community would love to see a lot less added sugar in foods. Unfortunately, community doesn't really have the level of control over the system that it needs to have to actually enact that. So community needs government to implement a sugar tax or put some standards around maximum levels of maximum acceptable levels of added sugars, or require warning labels in particular settings. And I think that, what community can do is be more vocal and express to their representatives that this is actually what they want. Of course, the most powerful thing they can do is change their shopping purchases, and because that ultimately is what will drive industry action, even if government won't take the action. So there are some things that community can do, but the track record would say that actually community's power in this setting has been minimal in terms of actually really driving the sorts of changes that we need in the food system, and we really need government to be a bit bolder than it currently is.
So, Peter, did you want to add to that?
Oh, look, I can't particularly add from the Maggie point of view, Barbara, but from my own experience, I just perhaps contextualize a little bit that the last 20, 30 years has seen an aggregation, globalization of major food manufacturing to what's called big food now. The majority of Australian manufacturing has moved offshore. So we really, when we're talking about, when Bruce is talking about, major food companies, their head offices are not necessarily located in Australia, and their policy settings may come out of Europe or US or UK, somewhere like that. So the issue of big food is, I think, to be tackled in a way. The initiatives we heard Tim talk about are very much around the reconstruction of local food manufacturing and conversion initiatives. And I think to some extent, we need to have a look at and really what can we do to get more food innovation and food manufacturing back on shore so that we can take some control as a country of our food decisions and our food content, if you like.
No. Tim?
Yes, look, sorry, my internet connection's unstable. I'm sorry, I've been dropping in and out a little bit, Barbara, but yeah, look, I guess, you know, when I look at that longer term trend, what I see is that there'll be potentially a localization of food production. If you can grow food in a greenhouse, you control the conditions. It doesn't matter whether you're on the equator or in the Arctic, you know, you can grow the same food. So there'll be less food, I guess, transport. And, you know, the same is true for all of the bacteria and archaea-based products that people are now looking at for, say, bread and whatever. It'll be grown locally. So I suspect the long-term trend might be towards much more localised production, a bit like clean energy. You know, oil is only produced in certain parts of the world, and therefore there was a great business in transporting oil internationally. But sunlight and wind are everywhere. So, you know, they're much more localised production. So I suspect that's going to be the longer term trend. But as I said, I'm looking at a long way there. The other speakers are looking at a much more short term problems, and they're absolutely right in what they say. I guess somewhere between that long term and short term view, we'll see a way forward.
So that's really good. Thank you, Tim. But you know, there's a huge food waste going on. You know, reducing food waste, which accounts to about 88% of greenhouse gas emissions globally. And, you know, there's a low-hanging fruit to reduce heat trapping emissions and into agroforestry and emissions and all of that. You know, how do we overcome this issue of food waste just now?
Yeah, well, look, there's tremendous work being done and has been done for many years by companies such as Novo Nordisk, the great enzyme production company based in Denmark. You know, their work on innovation on enzymes for bread and so forth, and bread products, means that the bread we get today, you know, it can last weeks rather than just a day. It used to, you know, if you've been and if you go back to the bad old days and remember how quickly mold used to grow on your bread, it doesn't do that anymore so much. So there are some technological aspects that are solutions. There are other structural problems that are very difficult in terms of food waste, like the use by dates and the throwouts and so forth around supermarkets. And I think there are some groups doing some great work in that area too. I guess, you know, when you get to a future where you can start producing your food in vats right in the city, you've got a much tighter production chain. You know, you can just make as much flour as is needed. Obviously, there's some ramp up required, but I imagine there'll be less food waste into the future as we develop these technologies.
So there is a lot of talk, a lot of chatter around climate change and how it will threaten our food security in years to come. And, you know, some of the things that you're looking at long term, Tim, do you believe that will contribute towards, you know, looking at some future ways of food?
Well, I think that those future technologies that I've been talking about, because they are further down the food chain and they're very local and under control conditions, they free you from the risk to some extent of that climate disruption that we are talking about. You know, you can imagine in today's world with its increasing heat waves and bushfires and droughts and so forth, that food security is imperiled. And indeed, we see large swings in production. You know, Australia was importing wheat just 3 years ago, you know. So these, as I said earlier, what we saw with COVID accelerating some trends that are already in place, I think that's what we'll see with climate change. It will accelerate trends that are just beginning now, because the outcome in the future is more resilience against climate change. So we shall see, but that's my guess.
And now that's really, really good. So, you know, Australia has pledged to cut waste by 50% by 2050. Do you think there is any opportunity for us to bring that forward? I mean, given we're looking at some of the technologies and, you know, how adaptive or how much of this is the government's taking on board?
Oh, look, I don't think government's even begun to think about this sort of stuff yet. You know, it would be very good to see better regulatory controls over a whole lot of things. I mean, and you know, there are synergies across the whole board. So if you've got better conditions for your animals, you know, that's a good thing for the whole of production, you know, generally, I think, and for the quality of food you get out of it. It would be interesting. It's going to be challenging for government because, you know, what you're talking about in the end is the kind of decline of broadacre agriculture, you know, and that has its own political challenges, just like the end of coal has, you know, has political challenges. So we're looking at very large-scale transformations in human society. Can I just add one rather whimsical thing here, if you don't mind? I'm an evolutionary biologist, you know, so I study other species, and there are other agriculturalists in the animal world, and the most famous of them are the ants and termites, which produce their food through cropping, you know, but they all do it under extremely controlled conditions. Mm-hmm. So the little in termite nests, the little area where they grow their fungi, temperature and humidity might vary by 1 or 2 degrees or 1 or 2%. It's extremely controlled. And they've got very specialised pesticides and so forth in those little controlled areas, which are used just when they're required if a bug ever gets in. The ants are the same. And this is a result of 10 million years or 50 million years of evolution in some cases. And you see that the future of agriculture is not these great leaky, you know, broadacre systems that are only 10,000 years old. It's actually in very, very tightly controlled, where you control the conditions, minimise the risk, minimise the inputs you have to put in. So I think that's where we're headed.
Mm-hmm. I have a question on the chat here for you, Tim. What is the view on the future of blue food, WRT, impacts of climate change, also impacts of microplastics on blue food nutrition?
Could you, I'm sorry, I've got such a poor internet connection. You have to speak up, Barbara.
Okay,
I can't hear.
Sorry. What is your view on the future of blue food, WRT, impacts of climate change, also impacts of microplastics on blue food nutrition?
Yeah, fair enough. Well, look, you know, the oceans are the massive challenge for this. We're finding that as we pollute the ocean and as we draw down the fishing stocks, we're actually affecting ocean function and even the ability of the ocean to draw down carbon. So and because it's a commons, the ocean, you know, much of it, not all of it, but much of it, it's very, very hard to regulate. And I'll talk at the very broadest level for this, yeah. But if we look at the great whales and the destruction of the great whales that occurred half a century ago, that stopped a critical pathway for carbon sequestration. It was sequestering about 1 gigaton of carbon a year. So, you know, the great whales would eat the plankton, they defecate, that would fertilise the oceans, and some of the carbon from that would get into the deep ocean where it was locked out of the system. So we're doing the same now with fish. You know, 90% of fish stocks are overfished. So we desperately need better mechanisms to regulate our take from the oceans. The microplastics, I'm not an expert on, but from what I read, that is a major issue for the health of the fish. So yeah, we need solutions. And I did see just last week, in fact, one of the initiatives to clean up the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, plastic patch, was meeting with some success. So people are getting out there, pulling some of those plastics out of the oceans, not yet at the scale required, but I think it's things like that that give me hope that we can really improve the health of the oceans.
So, you know, one of the things that I just really wanted to, Bruce, is, you know, we talked about, you're quite passionate to talk about or how we can bring about change, but, you know, about labels, about targets, about education and educating government and trying to bring conversation around that. So I want to try and think about, you know, how can we advocate to the governments to try and get the labelling a lot better than it really is. The other thing I wanted to say is we all talked about sustainability, food systems, a holistic approach, you know, that we need to address the multidimensional objectives. How do we capacity build in these areas? And I think that is the issue for us. We just don't seem to have capacity, and there's lots of us doing lots of different things. But how do we have this holistic approach to governments or whatever? And the other thing I wanted to end on and get your views on is that how do organisations like Nutrition Australia, New South Wales, help reduce some of the issues we're talking about. How do we make sure that people do get nutritious food and be able to live a healthy life? So I'll throw it open, whoever wants to take it on, Bruce or Tim or Peter.
I'll make a quick comment on the first one around sort of labelling and sort of the practicalities of that. So I think there's a really nice example in Australia. So in terms of nutrition, we've had health star rating labelling, which frankly is actually a really good idea. I mean, it's not the solution to everything, but it's a really good idea. But 6 or 7 years on, we still only have 40 or 50% of products labelled because it's voluntary. By contrast, we have country of origin labelling, which was introduced several years later, but is now on 90% plus of products because it's mandatory, which HSR isn't. And the reason it's mandatory is because there is an alignment of interest between industry, who thinks that having country of origin labelling is going to help them sell more local product, which is absolutely fine. With health star ratings, of course, there's a big chunk of industry that doesn't want the label because it might reduce the number of products that they're going to sell. So there are two things here that I think we can take from this. You know, one is we need to be more imaginative in terms of finding the dualities of interest between what industry wants and what public health needs. And the second is that we also need government, as I've said before, to be in the position to be a bit bolder and a bit more forthright in what it does. I'll let someone else answer the other questions, Barbara.
Thank you very much. Look, we are just on 11 o'clock. I'm going to have to try and wrap this up. Can I say it's been a terrific session. I wish we had a longer time. I thank all of you, but can I now call on David Brady? David is a dear friend of mine, and he's the chairperson of Deafness Forum of Australia and an advocate for Nutrition Australia and New South Wales, to give a vote of thanks. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you very much, Barbara, and thank you to everybody who spoke today. Just quickly to summarise and bring back to where we started from, we heard from a new South Wales Treasurer, Matt Kean. He talks, Matt, obviously we all know, is a very progressive politician, but also very interested in the importance of, you know, the food, the climate, and all of the things that come together. And I think we heard that from all of our speakers today, especially Dr. Bruce Neal. We've talked a lot about the impact of smarter consumer choices, which is really is quite the key. I mean, consumers need to know more when they're buying the food, because food is very personal. And I really like the fact that they talk about data, and I think data in today's world is, I think this the whole decade is definitely the data decade, because data will address how we as not only localise, but also national, but also global scale in how we have to address all of the challenges we have. And more importantly, talk about regulation and change. And that's sort of kindly segued into what Peter Kenny was actually speaking about, the bringing together regulation. We talked about the Royal Commission and Abuse. We've got a result of that. It's so pleasing to hear that there is a Congress to bring together the aged care providers to talk about nutrition for our elderly. Most of my fathers in an aged care home, and I'm sure quite many of us here today might have someone they know in the aged care home, and we only wish that they are eating nutrition and they are eating well and healthy, so we can be with them longer. Especially, and now I've got a new child and really want to see the grandfather. So I think that sort of links very well there. And then really importantly, I think really touched base there from Peter about the skills and training of staff. And I'm really curious to see where innovation and technology and the knowledge, especially from Nutrition Australia, to bring that to the aged care sector. Really important, because it could be really simple, but if you don't know how to do it, it's not going to be done. And we also heard from a great Professor Tim Flannery, a leading voice in climate, really understanding about the impact of climate and the really importance of us to, I like to say, stop and think moment. What are we doing? Where are we going? But also what people are already doing. And he highlighted the fact of things around the city food. I like to call that city food, where you can stay at home and your food is grown in your home or in your unit or your block or collective. We've already seen people out there using old tennis courts to become community farms or community food gathering places. So I can see great hope in that, and also the great hope in innovation and technology. And I'll just wrap it all up there. And I know that thanks to all the three of you, as well as to Matt Kean and also to Barbara. Before I finish the note, thanks to Barbara Ward, but it's just the theme is basically everything to do with the climate. It impacts the environment, and it also goes down to the food, and that leads to nutrition. And all of that's just a cycle, and it means we have to stop and think. And I think all three panelists today actually showed it, each part of the sector going into that. Barbara, thank you to you and the board of Nutrition New South Wales Australia, just bringing this to it, and as a chair of a not-for-profit, and knowing that you do on a voluntary time, as well as your board and all the members, to take it to government, to bring the experts in and to keep that voice up, because each one of us in our communities really rely on you, not to rely on you totally, but all the support that you do and all the lobbying, just to make sure that that voice, not only to keep government account, but to make sure that they're encouraged and involved to keep doing those reforms and changes, which we all really need, because the next decade is going to be very important. So thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dave. And again, I think the lesson for us is, the future is in our hands. And you heard the UN Secretary General speak about that as well. I'll now call on Raja, who is our board member, to wrap up the National Nutrition Week in New South Wales for 2021. Thank you, Raja.
Thanks, Barbara. In this week has been quite incredible, and it's been both positive and negative. And if the bottom line is, if we don't try and make the world we live in more sustainable, we'll need him, Batman right behind me, to come over and drive some change in all our behavior. So it's kind of one of my bottom line ideas have been through this fantastic week, honestly. And obviously the first week of freedom, if you're in Sydney, especially. I think Barbara, first of all, thanks for the opportunity to kind of close this event, this week-long event. It's been quite an incredible privilege and pride to be here with you and with everyone else, and learning so much about nutrition and how do we make the world we live in more ethical and more sustainable, as it were. But this event would have been possible for many, many people, and I'm sure I'll miss a few names. I got a list out here right in front of me, and I've got it in big bold, but I'm sure I'll miss a few names. If I do miss a few names, apologies. It's just because there's so many people who have supported us, and I just miss someone. To start with Laura. Laura, 3 cheers to you, lady. The absolute bundle of energy. This event's been working despite a few hacks by Zoom here and there. Laura, well done. Of course, Barbara, I have no clue. But I always ask her when I meet, what do you eat for breakfast? And she never tells me. No clue. I have no clue what she does for breakfast.
Food Switch helps me choose my breakfast.
No clue. Obviously, it is not what I eat for breakfast. Dave Brady, obviously a great man to have around at any forum, especially forums like these. It's just brilliant. Thank you, Dave. A few of our ministers were joined us, including the Minister for Health, Honourable Greg Hunt, and Minister Brad Hazzard, who have been very, very helpful to us through this week. The UNSW Health, of course, has been a key supporter for this event through the week. Lots of sponsors, lots of people, a lot of organizations who have helped us. Share SMR, especially big thanks to Adrian Prakash. I think he's been an incredible support to Barbara, to all of us at NANSW. LCI, every year they work with us, and they have been so good to help us deliver nutrition in the workplace. Sydney Markets, again, a very long-standing partnership. Happy Snack, our wonderful partners, Happy and Snack. And it is not an oxymoron. The George Institute for their support throughout the year, as it were. UNAA, and there's again Barb is again on the board. The National Indigenous Culinary Institute, I think that cookery show by Sam last week was just brilliant. And for people like me, who are cricket tragics, who actually wake up at 1 in the morning to watch CSK take on KKR in the finals of IPL and ICC T20 starting in a few days from now, for the support. The ICC T20 has been a big support to us. Thank you for them, to everyone. To all the board members of NANSW, especially, they have been such a pillar of strength, such sage advice, such support Thank you, everybody. Thanks a lot to make this work and helping us make this planet a more ethical, sustainable, nutritious place to be in. And in summation, I just go back to where I come from and my culture and the 4 words what we use to close any such events. The first is called Shantirastu. It means may there be peace. The second word we use is Tushtirastu. It means let there be contentment. The third word we use is Pushtirastu. Let there be prosperity. And the fourth word we use is Arogyamastu, which means that may all of us have good health. And you know what? In summary, if you're a Star Wars fan, may the force be with us. Thank you.
Very good. My husband would like that. He is a Star Wars tragic, I'm afraid. Once again, Bruce, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day and be with us today, Peter and Tim. It's a glorious day outside. It's a bit breezy. Enjoy our first Saturday of freedom, and thanks to our Premier Parate. Thank you all. See you all later. Bye-bye.